So our next speaker is Molly Crockett, Assistant Professor of Psychology at Yale University and a Distinguished Research Fellow at the Oxford Center of Neuroethics. Prior to joining Yale, Dr. Crockett was a faculty member at the University of Oxford's Department of Experimental Psychology and a Fellow of Jesus College. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Neuroscience from UCLA and a PhD in Experimental Psychology from the University of Cambridge. Molly also completed a Wellcome Trust postdoctoral fellowship with economists and neuroscientists at the universities of Zurich and University College London. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome me in welcoming Molly.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a psychology professor, and in my lab, we study moral behavior. And on April 9th, 2017, United Airlines Flight 3411, flying from Chicago O'Hare Airport to Louisville, Kentucky, was overbooked. And after no one volunteered to give up their seat, a passenger was selected by lottery for removal from the flight. The passenger refused to give up his seat when requested, and what happened next was captured on video by another passenger.
Can't the pilots drive to Louisville? Can't they rent a car for the pilots and have them drive? Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God! No! My guys, my God! What are you doing? No, this is wrong! Oh my God! Look at what you did to him! Oh my God!
This video went viral, ultimately reaching more than 100 million viewers. The hashtag #BoycottUnited quickly trended on Twitter, and then the memes started. The incident was a public relations nightmare for United. A survey conducted shortly afterwards found that 79% of respondents would choose American Airlines over an identical United Airlines flight. And the market responded. United Airlines stock prices dropped by $1.4 billion following the viral video. But is outrage always bad for brands? Recently, companies have been experimenting with using outrage to drive marketing. So for example, a Nike ad featured Colin Kaepernick and his protests against police brutality. And a Gillette ad built off the Me Too movement in an ad targeting toxic masculinity. Both companies faced backlash after these ads ran. So some consumers posted videos on Twitter of burning their Nike products. And the Gillette ad received backlash on social media, and the video itself on YouTube had twice as many dislikes as likes. Some consumers also questioned the motives of these companies, accusing them of perverting social justice in a cynical ploy to make money. Ultimately, though, the Gillette ad did not hurt sales of Gillette products, and Nike's ad even drove a spike in sales. Now, it's hard to say whether these two examples are representative more broadly of how moral outrage might drive market responding. So to better predict how moral outrage affects marketing, it's crucial to understand the psychology of moral outrage and how it might be changing in the digital age. And this is what we're studying in my lab. Let's start with a few definitions. So broadly, we consider moral outrage as anger and disgust at the violation of a perceived moral standard. There's evidence that moral outrage leads to desire to shame and punish the wrongdoer. And it can motivate collective action to achieve the goals of a particular social group. Outrage is also effective in enforcing social norms in the sense that being targeted by outrage makes you more likely to comply with those norms. Now, the fact that outrage promotes norm compliance suggests that one way that outrage might have evolved by promoting cooperation within social groups. Those groups with more people who are willing to shame and punish wrongdoers cooperate better and outcompete other groups with less people willing to do so. Another complementary explanation for why outrage might have evolved comes from the fact that expressing outrage is good for individuals. It builds your reputation as being a trustworthy person. Now, of course, on social media, this explodes, right? So what is it that motivates expressing outrage in the moment? Well, as we saw before, people might express outrage for pro-social reasons. They want to punish somebody who's violated a norm in order to teach them a lesson. There can be self-serving motives as well. So people might punish in the moment, express outrage online in order to signal something about their moral character to others, also because it just feels satisfying, right? And both of these motives are present from a really early age. In my lab, we've shown they operate from the age of 4. Now, these multiple motives can also be seen in brain imaging studies. So pro-social motives are correlated with brain activity in higher order cognitive areas, including dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. But also the reward system, including the striatum, is involved in expressions of outrage and punishment. Now, these psychological and neural mechanisms that are behind outrage expression evolved in a really particular environment. They evolved in the context of small face-to-face interactions in small groups. But of course now, outrage is widespread on the internet, and it's appearing in contexts that's very different from the context in which it evolved. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to lay out some research that we've been doing in my lab to try and understand how the digital age might be changing the way we experience and express moral outrage. And this hypothesis is built around a really simple framework inspired by a really old set of theories in psychology known as reinforcement learning theory. And the basic idea is that moral outrage is triggered by stimuli that call attention to a moral norm violation. People then express outrage with a variety of responses that can vary in terms of how costly they are. And then expressing outrage on social media can lead to different social and personal outcomes. People in your network see you expressing outrage, and they might like that, they might share that. And these social outcomes can reinforce the responses and make them more likely to occur in the future. So this framework helps us to organize our thinking around how digital technologies might be changing the nature of moral outrage. So starting with the stimuli. Digital technologies alter the stimuli that trigger outrage in a couple of different ways. The first has to do with just the simple frequency of how often people are encountering events that might trigger an outrage expression. So we've looked at data from a study where participants were signaled multiple times a day on their smartphones, and they were asked whether they had experienced or witnessed or learned about any moral or immoral acts within the past hour. And then they were asked various emotional responses to this. One thing that I found when looking at this data is that people learn about a much higher frequency of immoral acts online compared to other forms of media like TV, news, radio, as well as even in person. And so what this means is that going online exposes us to far more triggers of outrage than we might experience in our daily lives. The second change has to do with the content of the triggers of outrage. Now, before the internet existed, people shared information that was primarily valuable for promoting cooperation and trust within their communities. But in the age of Facebook and Twitter, where information sharing platforms generate revenue through holding our attention, newsfeed algorithms are going to promote information that's most likely to be reshared, irrespective of whether or not it's socially useful or even true. So you get content like this. You get content that's really triggering of outrage, but might not necessarily represent reality. So what is it exactly that makes online content go viral? Well, research has shown that emotions, and particularly high arousal emotions like anger and those to do with morality, are particularly effective at driving the spread of information online. So recent work by Billy Brady and colleagues has shown that moral emotional words like attack, bad, blame, care, destroy are particularly likely to go viral on Twitter. In particular, if you look at the presence of each of these types of words in a tweet for a variety of different political topics, including gun control, same-sex marriage, and climate change, every one of these moral emotional words contained within a tweet increases its likelihood of being retweeted by 20%. Now, this is not the case for words that are simply just moral or simply just emotional. It seems like there's something special about the combination of morality and emotion within the language people use to talk about these issues. And of course, those bad actors who want to promote the spread of disinformation seem to have intuited this. So here is an example of an ad from the Russian Internet Research Agency that they put on Facebook during the 2016 elections. There were more than 3,000 ads like this. They reached an estimated 126 million people. And they were able to reach this many people because Facebook's newsfeed algorithms select for the content that provokes the most outrage. And the data that I've looked at is consistent with the idea that when people encounter immoral or triggering information online, they experience more outrage compared to encountering immoral information that they find out about in person or through traditional forms of media like TV, news, and radio. And the driving force behind these results, although we can't say for sure, is probably going to be something about content, that these environments might be selecting for content that's more likely to go viral. Next, let's take a look at how online settings transform these responses that we make online when we encounter information that triggers outrage. So if we want to express outrage in an offline context, we have a few options. We can gossip to damage somebody's reputation. We can directly confront them verbally or physically. And of course, these different options vary and they kind of increase as you go down that list in terms of how much effort they require and how risky they are, right? They carry potential physical risks sometimes for the outrage expressor. But of course, online, a lot of these costs and risks are reduced. So online, we can express outrage with just a few keystrokes. We can post angry comments either directly to the target or for a more general audience. We can do this from the comfort of our own bedrooms. And we can hide in a crowd. So it's clear that all of these different responses require a lot less effort online than offline. And that means that a given person's threshold for expressing outrage is likely to be lower online than it is offline. A further speculative hypothesis that we've been thinking about in my lab is that the design of social media platforms might encourage habitual outrage expression. Social media apps streamline these triggering stimuli and available responses into a heavily designed stimulus response outcome architecture that's likely to engage the brain's reinforcement learning circuitry. Now, sharing the most outrageous content is the best way to get likes and shares, and this social feedback is delivered at unpredictable times. A delivery of reward schedule known as a variable interval schedule in reinforcement that's well known to promote habit formation. So just like a habitual snacker would reach for the bag of potato chips without actually feeling hungry, there's a question as to whether the design of these social media environments might be inducing some people to express outrage online without actually feeling that emotion themselves. Finally, how does social media transform the outcomes of moral outrage? One important cost of outrage and punishment is the possibility that you will be retaliated against. And this is, of course, less of a worry online because people are grouping together into like-minded networks. This creates sympathetic audiences that reduce the risks of retaliation, particularly when it comes to posting about political issues. And furthermore, in the case of viral online shaming, each individual punisher is just one voice among thousands, which makes it difficult for targets to retaliate. Another potential cost of expressing outrage is that most of us naturally find it distressing to harm people to their face. And lab studies have shown that people are much less willing to express outrage towards others and to punish them when they can see their face. Online, of course, these empathic costs of outrage are reduced because people are reduced to an avatar. You might not see their face at all. Now, as I mentioned earlier, expressing outrage has both social and personal benefits. On the social side, outrage can motivate wrongdoers to change their behavior, and this promotes cooperation in groups. And then on the personal side, of course, outrage can signal your trustworthiness to other individuals. Now, one possibility is that social media and these digital online platforms amplify the personal benefits of outrage. You can express outrage to a much wider audience on social media than you can offline. If you tell somebody off for making a sexist remark in person, you might only get credit for that from whoever happens to be watching at the time. But if you tweet about it, it gets broadcast to your entire social network. And so this really amplifies the personal benefits of expressing outrage. But there's a question as to whether the social benefits are amplified or maybe even reduced. So one possible cost of how outrage might be changing when you go from offline to online is a reduced signal fidelity. So if one function of outrage is to point out those actions and people who are deserving of punishment, then if you lower the threshold for expressing outrage and just dial it up, that's going to make it a lot harder to distinguish between what is just annoying and what is truly heinous and deserving of punishment. Secondly, because social networks have this property of homophony, where people are grouping together with like-minded individuals, when it comes to political disagreement, if people are mostly connected to people they agree with politically, this limits the potential for dialogues that could potentially progress discourse on issues. So this is a figure showing retweet networks for moral emotional content by Brady and colleagues. Moral outrage is shared much more from liberals to other liberals and from conservatives to other conservatives than between those ideological networks. And so this can potentially limit the ability of outrage to move the conversation forward in our society. So to conclude, and just to summarize these different points, technology companies have argued that their products provide neutral platforms for social behaviors, but not changing those behaviors themselves. And this is, I think, an empirical question that behavioral scientists can and should address, because the answer has ethical implications, has implications also for business, and it'll be interesting to hear your thoughts on that in the Q&A. Just end by thanking my research team who have been working on this project and our funders, and I'll look forward to getting some questions from the audience.
Very interesting. A couple of questions. One is, what do you think some of the reinforcement is from a personal perspective, in that maybe there are some psychological aspects to being morally outraged, on a regular basis? Thoughts on that? I know you're talking from a reinforcement theory but as a fellow social psychologist, I'm curious as to your perspective on that. And my second question is, what is the consequence for people who are in this state of moral outrage on a regular basis? What is the absolute, what are the repercussions for essentially rewiring your brain? So just a couple of questions.
These are great questions, and I mean, I think that we don't have a good answer really to the second one in particular. In regards to your first question, I think there's already evidence from both brain imaging studies and psychological studies that there's something immediately satisfying in the moment about expressing outrage. And that could be the result of just a really ancient evolved instinct, or potentially also to do with learning about our social group and our social identity and the groups that we spend time in. Reinforcing those identities is really powerful because it makes us feel more connected to our social group. With respect to the long-term consequences of the constant outrage, I don't think we have a good answer to that. And although there is some data suggesting that expressions of anger on social media have been increasing over time, one question is whether those expressions are reflective of genuine emotional responses, or if the design of the platforms is actually divorcing the expression of the emotion from the experience of the emotion. And these are questions we're studying right now in my lab.
Very interesting research. Do you believe that the effects will be the same on the opposite side of the continuums when people are expressing moral approval? Mm-hmm. So is the psychology just the opposite of it, which would be just another form of self-expression, for example?
There actually is data to suggest that positive emotions are also predictive of virality online. And so to the extent that those positive emotions can reach the intensity level of the negative ones, they are also very effective at driving engagement.
I'm thinking back to your examples of brands that have dabbled in moral outrage messaging. I would hypothesize that the intensity of the emotional response that a person has to a branded message that does trigger moral outrage would lead to a more permanent brand memory. Do you have any feel for whether that hypothesis is true?
I think that the research on emotion and memory would directly support that hypothesis. I don't think it's been tested in that exact context, but I think that's a reasonable prediction. And so it leads to some interesting, I think, applied questions about the effectiveness of using moral outrage in advertising. If you can evoke a positive emotional response to be associated with the brand, that might pay off in the long run, but I think it's a double-edged sword, and there aren't enough examples yet, I think, to know whether this is on average a good strategy or a bad one, and it's probably going to be really context-specific as well.
We've got time for one more.
In your research, have you seen any platforms take steps that would mitigate like the allowance or the acceptability of outrage in a digital space? So like using their real names or something. Have you seen anyone take a meaningful step in that direction?
Not yet, and I think the tricky thing with moral outrage in particular that is useful to contrast with, say, disinformation, is that I think we can all agree that there should be less disinformation being shared on social media. But I don't think that there's a straightforward answer when it comes to moral outrage, because on the one hand, moral outrage is a really socially useful emotion, and when used collectively, particularly online, it can achieve really positive outcomes, particularly for underrepresented groups who might not have had the ability to organize and mobilize before social media. But on the other hand, there are potentially bad consequences of dialing up the volume in general. And so I think the conversations right now that are happening between industry and academia are how should we really be thinking about the ethical frameworks that can guide decisions about whether and how to regulate this kind of expression online.